over the last few weeks, I've had a few times that motivation has come up in conversation with different people. I've also had it come up in probably the last three books I've read. It's also been in a couple of podcasts that I've listened to where they're talking about motivation and action and how those two things work together or don't work together sometimes. Lots of time we find ourselves, myself included, saying that we lack the motivation to do the thing that we want to do. And we're sitting around waiting for motivation to strike like lightning, where just like it's just going to come out of nowhere and just happen. And from what the books I've read, the podcasts I've listened to, some digging that I've done on my own separately, is that it doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's something that creates the motivation, and then therefore you go and follow that with action that comes after the motivation. You want to do the thing, now you go do the thing. It's a lot easier. But that motivation just doesn't pop up out of thin air like we would like it to. It would be a lot easier if that would happen and it would just magically appear when we want, when we know that we should be doing that thing, but we really don't want to. And it would be nice if that motivation would just kind of pop up right then and there. And it won't unless we can kind of trick ourselves into it to a degree. And so motivation, first and foremost, when it first hits and you have that fresh idea and it's something you're really excited about, when years ago I was traveling and I was reading lots of fantasy books and I had this great idea. I was like, oh, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write. And then I started writing the book. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, there's so many different, like I could write a whole series. I have so many different ideas. And I kept writing and writing. I had lots of time to do it. I was traveling. I had no obligations essentially while I was doing it. So I could kind of do whatever I want, whenever I want. So I would basically read fantasy novels and then I would go on hikes. I was in New Zealand, so I'd go on hikes in this beautiful country. It would give me a whole bunch of ideas. And it just kind of happened where there was days I was like, I just want to, yesterday was great and I want to sit down and I want to just write out all these ideas that I had while I was doing all these other things and reading these other books and yada yada. And it kind of feels like it just naturally comes along. And then all of a sudden, I came back home, got a job, had a lot more obligations things that I had to do, and it gave me a lot less time to write, but also to have that time to be creative. And all of a sudden it was like, well, I don't have the motivation to do this anymore. And I didn't look at the book again for like 4 or 5 years. I never touched it. It just sat there on my computer. And it was like I had lost all the motivation to do it. I had no interest in doing it anymore. And even as I tell that story, it pops up in my head of like, well, yeah, the motivation just didn't come out of nowhere. It came because I was reading fantasy novels, which then were triggering thoughts in my head about how I would write a book. I was out hiking and I would see beautiful scenery and I could almost like envision a part of my book happening on that landscape that I saw out in front of me. And it was actually the activity that I was doing that was then creating this motivation for me to be like, oh, I want to write this book. This is cool. I have all these ideas. And then I would go and I would spend all day, the next day, the whole day writing different things down and different plots and storylines and whatever. And I would sit there and have all these different ideas. And it wasn't because I was just motivated to do it. I was acting my way into motivation. And that's what a lot of all of these books that I've read over the last little while, the last like three or so, been a bunch of podcasts. They all say that action leads to motivation or motivation follows action. It comes after you have an action that then kind of sparks that motivation, if you will, and then leads you into more action and doing the things afterwards. So there's lots of different ways that you can do this and that you can help to spark that motivation. And it takes some figuring out. Like I literally didn't think about it for 4 years, about writing this book for like 4 years. And then all of a sudden I went on like a big trip and didn't really have any work to do. And we were just hiking and enjoying scenery and chilling. And then all of a sudden I got that spark again. I was like, oh, I could I could add this to it, and I could add this scene, and I could, maybe tweak this little piece of it. And then all of a sudden I was back to kind of jotting things down and making little notes about how I would tweak the book that I had already and things I would add to it and yada yada. But it was actually that activity of going and hiking, reading again, and all those sorts of things that then led to the motivation for me. So having those little actions that can spark some motivation and figuring out what those little actions are really important and will be really helpful in creating the motivation and moving things forward. And some of them will be harder than others for sure. And there'll be different difficulties based on your experiences that you've had with that thing over time. So what I mean by that is when you first initially have the thought and the idea, you're really excited in and of itself just because it's really cool and it's exciting and you're motivated to do the thing. But then all of a sudden you have setbacks, you have new challenges that come in, and different things kind of negatively affect your drive to do that activity and that thing. And in order to kind of counteract that, I think there is a few things that can happen in that you can have these actions, these quick actions that will kind of help spark that again, which we'll talk about more. You can find a way to connect it back to, a really deep why or a really deep desire within yourself, something that you really want to do and that you think connects to who you are and what your purpose maybe is in this world and things like that. And having that deep-seated connection to that activity will help to kind of ease you into or re-kickstart and let that motivation kind of build up a little bit when it's got a deeper connection. That will play a part as well. And then you can also use some of these negative things as a little bit of motivation as well. When you have a challenge, when you have a failed attempt at something, it's not necessarily is it always just like, oh, this is hard, that was a failed attempt, or oh, this is getting really difficult to find time, I should just stop and give up. Sometimes those can be feedback, and they can tell you in a way of how you can, the things that are in the way and how you can get them out of the way, or the things that are you did wrong in the past that you may need to switch or change slightly or alter in order to allow you to have more success going forward. So they're not necessarily always these things that we term as negative can be flipped into a positive thing. But again, I think that takes some having a deeper connection to yourself in that you're willing to fight through and find the good parts of those negative experiences to then connect it back to you and help you find the good thing to move forward with. So there is a little bit of that, and that's just mind games and trying to kind of trick yourself to a degree sometimes into finding the good thing in that kind of negative experience that you're having that potentially made you feel really yucky, and that's fine. It's a feedback mechanism of, I don't like this, I want this, but this is in the way. How can I change so I don't have this and that I can go this direction instead? What do I need to change beforehand so I can avoid that and create a better line to the thing that I actually want? Rather than just like, oh, that didn't work and I'm done, right? So there is a little bit of that. But going back to the actions, I think this is something that a lot of people miss out on, is that sometimes you have to act your way into motivation. And I mean, probably almost all the time to a degree, in that you need to do something that's going to spark that. So that can be, depending on the thing, it's going to vary in degree of how big or how small what it is. But it could be as simple as every day I need to sit down and I need to write one paragraph. And that's what I start with. And having that like little quick Kickstarter, as kind of how I term it in my head, of I need to get up in my office and I need to sit down at my computer and I need to write one paragraph. I absolutely have to. That is the absolute kind of bare minimum. And then having a secondary piece that is kind of a minimum effective dose as well to go along with that. So you have your Kickstarter, which is super easy, minimal to no barrier to entry. The easier it is to do and to start, the more likely and the more successful that will be and lead into the further action and motivation coming down later. And so that needs to be very, very, very simple, and you need to remove as many barriers as physically possible. Like potentially I just don't even close my computer, so it's open. When I sit down, it's on the page already ready to go, and I just start typing, right? Opening, logging in, opening the app. Maybe I open a different one, I get sidetracked. Remove all those barriers. It's already there, set up, ready to go, and I just start typing. Have to do a paragraph in this example of me writing a book. And then that secondary goal or secondary step of kind of a minimum effective dose. And what I mean by that is this is the minimum that I can achieve that will still be, for me, successful if I decide to stop. If I don't have that spark and I'm pressed for time, this is like the minimum that I can do before I go and do the rest of the stuff. Things like that kind of play into that second phase, if you will. The other part of that is, hopefully in an ideal world, you set up that second phase as this is kind of the minimum dose I need in order for me to then get that momentum into some motivation and continue then for hours on this project that I'm doing, if it takes that long, and to can keep you moving forward. And hopefully that minimum effective dose, and again, that might change depending on the day, depending on the week, depending on your past experiences. If you've had a lot of really negative experiences lately, you might need to make that minimum effective dose, might need to be a little bit bigger, right? So you can gather a little bit more momentum than typically. So then you can find that motivation, and it lasts long enough for you to build momentum into that motivation to overcome all of the negative that you've recently had. So those things will kind of fluctuate to a degree, I think, but finding that quick start's going to be really important. It's just like every morning I'm going to get up and I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to walk on the treadmill, and I have to start with 5 minutes. And in order for me to have a successful day, I have to work out for 30 minutes. And that can be on the treadmill, it can be something else, doesn't matter what it is, but there's a minimum effective dose that I need. And hopefully that leads me then to have enough motivation and momentum to then carry on to the actual big goal of completing the whole day of training, or the whole 2 hours of training, or the whole hour of training, whatever it is, or a whole hour of fitness, whatever you want to call it. That is the task that you had set out for today. This is what I needed to do today, and hopefully that minimum effective dose will then lead you into actually completing that full goal and activity for the day. Other things that I've done for momentum, quick start, kickstart kind of things is creating like a highlight reel for the activity on Instagram. For me, if I go on Instagram, and you can save different things into little folders. You can do it on Instagram, you can do it on Pinterest, you can do it on your computer, anywhere. It doesn't matter where you do it. I do it on Instagram. And for like lifting videos that really get me fired up, and that is like a spark. It's like, oh cool, I really want to go train now. I just watched this guy do something absolutely incredible. And now I have some motivation to go and I want to try to work on my thing that I've been working on. And I have 5 or 6 different little videos that I can go in and watch, and they really get me pumped up and ready to go. Doing things like that highlight reel, it can be for whatever. So if you're writing a novel, maybe you have a bunch of pictures saved somewhere of your ideas or of the types of characters that you like, or different things that just get your brain thinking about that activity and potentially wanting to kind of move forward with that activity. So highlight reels can kind of play into that minimum, that kickstart as well. But yeah, essentially what this boils down to for me is that action leads to motivation. It is very rare outside of that kind of initial onset of wanting to do the activity. Outside of that, there requires some sort of action for you to take in order to spark the motivation for you to then move forward. And those actions can be little 5-minute things, little 1-minute things. They can be highlight reels, little activities, bare minimums. You can think of them in that term. Make sure that they are as easy to do as physically possible. So remove as many to all barriers to entry into that activity so that it just makes it super easy and super streamlined for you to go and do that minimum activity, that minimum requirement. And then just kind of in the back of your mind, having kind of a minimum effective dose of, I need this thing to kickstart me and get me going. But once I'm going, I'm going to go for at least this long, or I'm going to, write at least this much, or I'm going to whatever it may be. But there's kind of that minimum effective dose that hopefully at the end of that, you kind of forget it, to be honest, and you just keep going. And that's where that hopefully that sparks the motivation for you to then take off, and away you go into, the rest of the activity to then hopefully achieve the full goal that you set out for that activity for the day or the week or the month, whatever it is. And then over top of all of that is connecting. Why is this thing even important to me? Why do I even care about achieving this big, huge goal that I'm going to need years or months or weeks or decades potentially of motivation and of action to achieve this thing? Why do I want this thing? Why is it important to me? Figure that out. And figuring that out can be very complicated. It can be very, very simple too sometimes. Some things you just know that, I'm doing this because this is what I am meant to do on this earth. Other things you got to dig a little bit deeper and figure out why it's important, get beyond the fact of, well, my parents told me that it's important. Well, is it important to you though? Why does it connect to something that drives you to fight through those negative experiences, to find the lesson in the negative experiences, and to keep fighting even though you potentially keep running into obstacles and running into challenges over and over again, and having to tweak and perfect your methods over and over and over and over to get you to that thing. Having that deep-seated connection to you and your desire and your why, your purpose, something that you're passionate about, something that you think defines you, having that connection is going to make it easier for you to have that kickstart and to fight through the kind of mud a little bit to get to that hopefully spark where motivation happens, and then it takes off from there. But the more that you can connect it to you, I think the more success, the higher chance of success you're going to have in overcoming any obstacle, challenge, thing that gets put in your way, or the lack of motivation that you have to then reach that goal at the end.